You were born to see what others don't even know exists, but your whole life people convinced you of the opposite. They told you that you were too complicated and too sensitive. What if I told you that all of this, in fact, is the trademark of one of the rarest psyches on the planet? That less than 10% of humanity carries what you carry, and that you've spent your entire life being measured by a ruler that was never made for you? Have you ever stopped to think about why you feel a little out of place in the world, even when surrounded by people? Why ordinary conversations drain you, while deep silences nourish you? Why you've always known that there was something hidden beneath the surface of things? Carl Gustav Jung spent his life studying this kind of person, and he reached a disturbing conclusion. You're not broken, you're just operating within a system that few people understand, and today, you're finally going to understand what it is. As a child, you probably couldn't put it into words, but you felt it. You felt it during school recess, when others laughed at jokes that seemed empty. You felt it at family gatherings when adults talked about things that to you carried no weight at all. You'd sit watching the corner of the room, noticing details no one else picked up on. And you'd hear an inner voice asking strange questions. Why do people pretend so much? Why do they speak without saying anything? Why does no one seem to notice what's really going on? That early perception wasn't arrogance. It was the first manifestation of something Jung called the introverted intuitive function, a rare way of processing the world that places those who possess it in a minority category of humanity. Maybe you remember specific moments. That afternoon when your mother called you to come play with your cousins, and you preferred to stay reading a book considered too advanced for your age. The day the teacher called your home because you were always staring out the window, lost in some quiet reflection. The birthday party where everyone ran off to the playground, while you stayed talking to the older aunt about subjects that left her impressed. Each one of those memories, when you look back, feels like a piece of a larger puzzle, and the puzzle is precisely the psychic blueprint of someone who came into the world equipped to see what escapes the majority. The problem is that no one taught you this. They taught you that you were too shy and too complicated. Your mother, with all her good intentions, would say that you needed to socialize more. Your father probably thought you read too many books. Teachers wrote on your report cards that you were intelligent but distracted. And you grew up with the silent idea that something was wrong with you, something that needed to be fixed. The truth is that nothing was broken. You were simply equipped with a different operating system, a system that society hasn't learned to recognize because it's too rare to become the majority. Jung dedicated years to trying to map these psychological types, and he himself confessed in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that the introverted intuitive was the most difficult to describe. Not because it was too complex, but because it operates on a plane that escapes ordinary language. This type sees patterns before they appear. They sense what's about to happen in a room before a single word is spoken. They pick up on the sadness disguised in someone's smile, the tension hidden behind a joke, the truth no one wants to admit in a meeting. This expanded perception generates natural isolation, because when you see what others don't see, it becomes hard to pretend you didn't see it. And here's the paradox that defines the life of this profile. On one hand, being rare is a blessing, because it means you were made to see paths others don't even know exist. On the other hand, it's a burden, because you carry a silent responsibility to translate the invisible for a world that only believes in what it can touch. Marie-Louise von Franz, a direct disciple of Jung and one of the greatest scholars of the human psyche of the 20th century, wrote in her contribution to the work Jung's Typology that these individuals tend to live a youth marked by the feeling of not belonging, until they discover the meaning of their own singularity. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. About you discovering it. Before we get to the 5 unmistakable signs that prove you belong to this rare profile, you need to understand that, according to the Myers-Briggs system, expanded from Jungian theories, there are 4 variations of this psychological type. 4 distinct ways in which the introverted intuitive manifests in the world. And perhaps by recognizing yours, something inside you will finally start to make sense. Imagine someone who walks into a crowded room and within seconds knows who's suffering in silence. They pick up on the couple that just had a fight before they even speak. They sense the colleague who fakes enthusiasm while being on the verge of falling apart. That's the INFJ, INFJ stands for introverted, intuitive feeling and judging, meaning someone who recharges in silence, picks up on hidden patterns, decides through an emotional compass, and organizes life around structure and clarity. Frequently pointed out as the rarest on the planet, representing less than 2% of the population in studies based on Myers-Briggs typology, a system developed from Jungian theories, the INFJ lives a silent drama. They feel other people's pain even before those people realize they're suffering. They walk into a room and pick up the emotional climate the way a seismograph picks up tremors. They listen to a friend talk about something trivial and notice, between the lines, that there's a much deeper wound beneath. This gift of reading emotions is at the same time their greatest strength and their greatest curse. The INFJ wants to help humanity. They feel an almost mystical calling to ease the suffering of others and to lead people toward better versions of themselves. But there's a brutal problem built into that impulse. To sustain that mission, they need a lot of time alone, recharging what gets spent in human contact. And when they don't honor that need, they wear themselves down. They become exhausted and disconnected. They turn into a bitter advisor from absorbing too much that wasn't theirs to carry. Jung warned about this kind of psychic exhaustion that strikes those who give themselves too much to the mission of caring for others without caring for themselves. There's a classic scene in the life of an INFJ that repeats itself in endless variations. It's the friend calling at 11 at night, in tears, telling the latest relationship drama. The INFJ picks up, listens, advises, offers a shoulder, stays up until dawn absorbing pain that isn't theirs. The next day, they wake up exhausted, unable to work properly, with that physical sensation of carrying someone else's weight. And the worst part is that this pattern repeats, because the INFJ has a tremendous difficulty setting limits. They feel that saying no is abandoning, and abandoning hurts the deepest values they carry. Learning to refuse requests and to protect their own energy is the work of a lifetime for this profile. Now think about someone who looks at a company and sees within seconds every point where it's going to collapse over the next 5 years. Who predicts the end of a marriage before the first anniversary toast? Who plays chess with life, while others are still learning the rules? That's the INTJ. INTJ stands for introverted, intuitive thinking and judging, meaning someone who recharges in silence, picks up on hidden patterns, decides through logic and analysis instead of emotion, and organizes everything around firm and structured plans. The INTJ is the solitary strategist, known in modern typologies as the architect. Here, the engine isn't feeling, but cold logic and structure. The INTJ looks at the world and sees systems. They see patterns in relationships and projects where others only see chaos. They detect flaws in plans before they're executed. They anticipate problems with a precision that borders on prophetic. Their mind is like a chessboard, where they've already calculated the next 10 moves, while others are still deciding which piece to move first. The INTJ's drama is the opposite of the INFJ's. They tend to distance themselves so much from emotions that they end up becoming sharp and isolated in a mental castle where only pure thoughts are allowed in. Von Franz wrote about this trap. She observed, in her patients of this profile, a progressive disconnection from their own bodies and from sensitive life. The INTJ needs to learn to integrate feeling, or runs the risk of growing old brilliant but empty, certain of everything but connected to nothing. The maturity of this type lies in discovering that intelligence without affection is just a sophisticated form of armor. The INTJ's life has predictable scenes. It's the professional who predicts the collapse of a project months before it falls apart, and no one listens, because their warning came without emotion, only with logic. It's the adult who looks at their parents' marriage and identifies, with frightening clarity, all the structural errors of that relationship, even without having lived through a long relationship themselves. It's the student who knew, since adolescence, that the career being pushed on them didn't match their nature, and even so, had to prove to themselves, after years lost, what their intuition already knew. The INTJ lives the strangeness of being almost always right, and almost always alone in their certainty. There's still another profile, The one who cries during a movie that no one else noticed was sad. Who writes letters they never send. Who quits a stable job because they couldn't stand the phoniness of the environment anymore. That's the INFP. INFP stands for introverted, intuitive, feeling and perceiving, meaning someone who recharges in silence, picks up on hidden patterns, decides guided by their own values, and keeps an open exploratory mind, always willing to revisit conclusions. The INFP is the dreaming idealist, known as the healer or the mediator. This profile is driven by deep values and a radical authenticity that borders on stubborn. The INFP lives, guided by an invisible inner compass, and when something in the outer world conflicts with that compass, they suffer physically. They can't work in a place that violates their principles. They can't keep a relationship with someone whose values are incompatible. They can't fake enthusiasm for causes that don't move their soul. The INFP carries an almost artistic sensitivity to the beauty and pain of the world. They find profound meaning in a leaf falling from a tree. They write journals and poems they never share because they need to translate into words the ocean they feel inside. The great challenge of this profile is turning idealism into concrete action. Many INFPs spend their lives dreaming of better worlds without ever rolling up their sleeves to build them. They end up disillusioned, feeling that life passed them by, that the world was never worthy of their dreams. The INFP's task is to come down from the castles of fantasy and root their ideals in the soil of practical reality. There's a particular melancholy in the INFP that few types understand. It's the feeling of carrying within yourself an entire life that was never lived, a body of work that was never made. The INFP sees, with painful clarity, the distance between what they're capable of being and what they have the courage to manifest. And that distance, over time, becomes a wound. That's why many in this profile need, at some point, to make a radical move of courage, to publish that piece of writing, to finish that project, to put that art out there, even with the fear of rejection. Because the alternative is a silent fading, lived through small daily abandonments of one's own potential. And there's still the last of them. The one who spends 3 hours debating a single philosophical concept with a friend at a bar and walks out with more questions than they started with. Who takes apart any statement to see the gears inside. Who'd rather have a fascinating theory than a Sunday lunch with the family. That's the INTP. INTP stands for introverted, intuitive thinking and perceiving, meaning someone who recharges in silence, picks up on hidden patterns, decides through logic, and keeps an open mind, always questioning and revisiting conclusions. The INTP is the investigative thinker, the philosopher. This profile questions absolutely everything. They don't accept an answer without understanding where it comes from. They take apart mental systems out of pure intellectual pleasure, like a child opening a toy to see the gears. The INTP is capable of spending an entire afternoon ruminating on a single philosophical question. To them, truth isn't a destination, it's an infinite journey. The INTP's drama lies in the excess of theory and the lack of practice. They get lost in mental labyrinths that could be solved with a simple action. They postpone important decisions waiting for absolute certainty. Certainty that will never come because reality doesn't offer that kind of guarantee. Their relationships suffer because they intellectualize emotions, turning every feeling into an equation. The INTP's maturity lies in learning that living is more important than understanding, and that some truths only reveal themselves when you throw yourself without a map into experience. The INTP usually has a recurring scene in their story. It's the philosophical discussion that stretches for hours with a friend, an entire night spent up trying to understand some concept that apparently has no practical application. It's the obsessive passion for a topic that out of nowhere ignites and consumes them for weeks, making them devour books and articles until they exhaust that subject and move on to the next. It's the inability to explain, in one short sentence, what they actually do with their life, because their mind works on so many levels at once that any summary would feel unfair. The INTP is a permanent seeker, and perhaps their greatest lesson is to discover that some questions don't need an answer. They just need to be lived. Despite the differences between these four types, there's something invisible that unites them, something Jung described carefully in psychological types. They all share the intuitive function as dominant, or auxiliary, combined with introversion. This means that, deep down, all these profiles perceive the world through a lens that captures hidden layers and symbolic meanings. They see what others don't see. They feel what others don't even know exists. And here we arrive at the heart of the problem. There's a central tension that defines the entire existence of this profile, and ignoring it is what makes so many people of this type live frustrated lives. On one side, the blessing of seeing what no one else sees. On the other, the crushing weight of not belonging. On one side, the inner depth that vibrates with philosophy and mystery. On the other, the demand of a society that only rewards those who settle for the surface. On one side, the flame of authenticity that refuses to pretend. On the other, the high price of being misunderstood that comes with every truthful choice. This conflict is the knot of your life. You feel it. You feel it every day, even without naming it. It's the tension of being pressured to be the same when your blood insists on being different. It's the exhaustion of constantly translating your inner experience into an outer language that wasn't built to capture it. And that knot only comes undone in one single way, which is what we're going to discover over the next few minutes. But first, it's time for you to recognize the 5 marks that prove you belong to the silent minority of humanity. The first sign is that you think in layers, not in straight lines. When someone asks you a simple question, your mind doesn't look for a direct answer. It immediately opens up dozens of possibilities, considers contexts, weighs nuances, examines exceptions. You want to answer well, you want to answer truthfully. And while your mind does all that, the person on the other end is already getting impatient, waiting for a yes or no that, for you, would be a betrayal of reality. I know it's hard to hear this, but you've probably been accused your whole life of overcomplicating things, of overthinking, of going off on tangents. People say this because they operate in a linear processing mode, and when they bump into someone who processes in layers, they feel uncomfortable. It's not that you complicate, it's that you see what was there the whole time, but what others haven't trained their minds to perceive. This thinking in layers comes at a cost. It tires you. It tires you deeply. You walk out of a 15-minute conversation with the feeling of having run a mental marathon. You go home exhausted, lie down in bed, and your mind keeps spinning, processing what was said and what wasn't said. Jung observed that the intuitive function, especially when introverted, operates at such a high frequency that it consumes a great deal of psychic energy. That's why this profile needs more rest and more silence than the average person. It's not weakness. It's the maintenance of a sophisticated operating system that processes information others don't even pick up on. And here's an important reflection. Everything that seems to be a problem in your life might just be a misunderstood characteristic of your psychological type. That feeling of always being tired after social events. That uncontrollable need to be alone after work. None of that is a defect. It's the signature of a mind that thinks in depth, and depth has a cost that needs to be respected. Reflect for a moment on how you process a simple question at work. Someone asks you what you think of a proposal. Your mind, in milliseconds, opens up branches. It considers the financial impact, but also the emotional one on the team. It weighs the short-term implications against the long-term ones. It evaluates whether the proposal fits the company's culture. It remembers a similar case that went wrong somewhere else. And while your mind performs that high-speed surgery, the person on the other end is tapping their foot impatiently, waiting for a simple yes or no. It's exhausting, but it's also the reason why, when you do speak, you usually hit the mark in a way others can't. The second sign is that surface-level conversations drain your soul. Have you noticed how you walk out of parties, company dinners, or family gatherings with the strange feeling of having been robbed? It's not money that was taken, it's life. It's something intangible that leaked out of you without you being able to stop it. This happens because your psyche seeks in every human interaction a real exchange, and when all it receives is noise and the repetition of empty formulas, It feels like it's starving at a banquet full of plastic food. I get it completely when you say you'd rather be alone than hang out with people who only talk nonsense. It's not misanthropy. It's an instinct of psychic survival. Jung wrote that conscious solitude is the fertile soil where the introverted psyche does its most important work. It's not escape. It's a natural movement of a mind that needs silence to reorganize itself and to access deeper layers of understanding. The problem is that modern society doesn't respect this need. You're pressured to participate in everything, to be present in every group, to keep in touch with everyone. Every notification on your phone, every invitation, every demand for your presence at social rituals that don't nourish you is a small silent aggression. And the guilt you feel for saying no, for isolating yourself, for choosing a Saturday at home instead of a party, is a guilt manufactured by a culture that doesn't understand your nature. There's a huge difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the painful emptiness of not having real connections. Solitude is the conscious choice to be with yourself, diving into your own inner world. The introverted intuitive needs generous doses of solitude to avoid burning out. And when they allow themselves that, without guilt, they discover that time alone isn't a waste. It's precisely the time in which they rebuild themselves, so they can later offer the world the best of who they are. Think about a typical Saturday. You woke up early, made your coffee, opened a book, and sat there, in silence, for hours. The phone rings. It's someone calling you for an impromptu lunch, maybe a movie in the afternoon. You feel an inner resistance you often don't even understand. Because on the surface it's a nice offer. Those are people you like. It should be a good thing. But something inside you knows that the invitation is going to steal the rest of your day. It's going to demand a reorganization of what you were building internally that morning. It's going to require a social performance you don't have the energy to deliver. And then comes the guilt. The guilt of being weird, of not being able to just say yes the way normal people do. But you're not normal in that respect. You're someone who needs to protect their inner space the way one protects a treasure. The third sign is that your inner life feels more real than the outer one. You spend hours in your inner world, creating imaginary dialogues, simulating conversations that may never happen, reflecting on philosophical questions that no one else around you seems to care about. To others, that's strange. To you, it's the most natural place in the world. And here lies a secret few dare to say out loud. The inner life of the introverted intuitive is often richer and more meaningful than anything that happens in the outside world. I'm not saying this to make you anxious, but to wake you up to a reality you may have never allowed yourself to see. This inner world isn't escape. It's the work of the introverted, intuitive function processing the world. Jung described, in Psychological Types, that this kind of person seems to always be looking inward, as if there were a parallel universe inside them. And there is. There exists in there a theater of ideas and symbols that form without anyone asking. This phenomenon is often confused with pathological isolation, and many of this profile reach adulthood believing they need to be corrected or sent to treatment. In some cases, the loneliness of the inner world really does become destructive isolation, and that needs attention. But in the vast majority, what's happening is just the natural expression of a psyche that does its deepest work in silence. Marie-Louise von Franz observed, over decades of clinical practice, how the most relevant psychic work happens in the inner layers, far from the noise of the world, and how trying to suppress that activity leads to deep burnout and existential crises. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this content, check out the first comment for our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. It was built for those who want to dive deep into these themes we're touching on here. And it might be exactly the next step for you who are starting to recognize yourself in this rare profile. Let's get back to the fourth sign, which is perhaps the most disturbing of all, because it explains something you've felt since childhood, but never knew how to name. The fourth sign is that you experience time differently from other people. For most, time is a line that separates what's been left on one side from what's still to come on the other. For you, no. Time is a room where everything coexists. You're here now, but you're also reliving a scene from 15 years ago, and at the same time you're projecting a scenario 5 years from now. You're washing the dishes, and suddenly you're in a childhood memory so vivid you can smell your grandmother's house. You're walking down the street, and your mind is calculating what the job you want a decade from now will be like. This sensation of living outside of time generates a particular anguish. You feel late for a life that hasn't arrived yet, and nostalgic for moments that have already passed, while you struggle to be present in the now. People tell you to be in the present, and you try, but your mind is built to navigate all temporal dimensions at once. It's not an attention deficit. It's the intuitive function working the way it's supposed to work. And here comes the luminous part of this sign. This expanded perception of time is what makes this profile naturally visionary. That's why many of the great thinkers and artists of history had this psychic configuration. They saw trends before they became evident. They sensed cultural and scientific shifts years in advance, not because they had a crystal ball, but because their minds integrated information from multiple temporal planes and projected it into the future with surprising accuracy. Jung, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, recounted episodes from his own life in which he sensed the future arriving before it happened. He described visions and intuitions that were later confirmed, and he attributed that precisely to the intuitive function working at its maximum power. He didn't call it something mystical or supernatural. He called it depth psychology, a real human capacity, present in all of us to some degree, but dominant only in some. If you recognize yourself in this description, maybe it's time to stop seeing it as weirdness and start treating it as a gift. Think about how many times you've felt something before it happened. That tightness in your chest before getting bad news. That strange certainty about a person you just met. Certainty that time would later confirm. You're not hallucinating. You're picking up on signals that were there, scattered in the environment, in the tone of voice and the choice of words, and your mind integrates all of that into a synthesis that looks like intuition but is in fact a highly sophisticated form of reading reality. Training yourself to trust that perception, instead of doubting it, is one of the most transformative steps you can take. You pick up on the invisible. Period. The fifth sign is the most painful, and at the same time the most liberating. You'd rather be misunderstood telling the truth than accepted living a lie. At some point in your life, perhaps very early on, you discovered that there's a high price to pay for being authentic. People walk away. Environments reject you. Families label you as difficult and problematic. And even so, even feeling the pain of being left out, you can't go back. You can't pretend, and you can't mold yourself to fit into spaces that demand small betrayals of the soul. It's completely valid to feel that, the loneliness of the truthful. But know that this trait is the trademark of what Jung called the process of individuation. Individuation, in simple terms, is the path of becoming who you truly are, integrating all the parts of your psyche, even the ones society rejects. Jung said that this is the inevitable destiny of certain people. It's not a choice, it's a calling, and whoever ignores that calling pays an even higher price than whoever accepts it. This pursuit of truth puts you in constant conflict with the world. At work, you can't praise what you consider mediocre. In relationships, you can't stand games of appearance. In the family, you butt heads with empty traditions. All of this costs you dearly, and you often wonder if it's worth it, whether it wouldn't be easier to give in and live on autopilot. But deep down, you know it wouldn't. That going back would be a slow withering, and that the only dignified choice is to keep going, even when it hurts, even when misunderstood. There's a shadow side to this profile that few have the courage to admit. The introverted intuitive, when they don't work on their shadow, can develop dangerous traits. They can fall into intellectual arrogance, thinking they're always right while others are shallow. They can also accumulate resentment toward humanity, living in an ivory tower where only they're right. These are the ghosts that haunt this psychological type, and Jung devoted an important part of his work to precisely this issue. The theory of the shadow, developed by Jung, teaches that everything we reject in ourselves doesn't disappear. It just goes underground in the psyche, and from there it acts without our control, sabotaging our lives. For the introverted intuitive, the shadow is usually in unlived emotions, in the neglected body, in the superficial relationships they look down on but secretly desire. Integrating the shadow means looking at all of that without running away, recognizing that those parts are also yours, and learning to live with them instead of fighting them. And here's the hard part. The shadow isn't integrated through thought. It's integrated through lived experience, through real encounter with the world. That's why many of this profile need, at some point in life, to come down from the tower, to leave the world of ideas and dive into the world of touches and contradictions, not to become like the others, but to recover parts of themselves that were left forgotten. Von Franz observed in her patients of this type a tremendous resistance to making that descent, but she insisted that without it there's no real maturity. There's only isolated brilliance, which over time rots into bitterness. There's a form of silent pride that haunts this profile, and few have the courage to admit it. It's the feeling of belonging to a more conscious, more perceptive minority than the average. That pride starts small, almost imperceptible, and grows over the course of life if it isn't worked through. One day, without realizing it, the person finds themselves looking down on others, judging conversations, considering themselves above ordinary motivations. That's the most subtle poison that can take over the soul of the introverted intuitive. And the antidote isn't to deny their perceptions, but to learn the humility of recognizing that every human being carries their own wisdom, even those who seem shallow, that there's also intelligence in simplicity and in contentment with the everyday. Learning to respect that is part of the maturing of this psychological type. Relationships are, perhaps, the most difficult terrain for this profile. You seek deep connections and encounters that transform. But most people only offer the basics, the office gossip, or the surface-level recap of what they saw on TV. And you feel hungry, a relational hunger that's never satisfied, because you're at a restaurant that only serves appetizers and you wanted the main course. I'm not saying this to leave you anxious, but to wake you up to a truth that can change everything. The path isn't to lower your standards, to fake interest in what doesn't move you, to accept shallow relationships just so you don't end up alone. The path is to be patient, to recognize that people on your frequency exist, but they're rare, that you may have to go through many empty encounters before you find a true connection. And that, in the meantime, your relationship with yourself needs to be cultivated as the most important soil of your life. When you finally meet someone who operates on your frequency, the feeling is of arriving home after a lifetime of traveling. The conversation flows effortlessly. The silences aren't uncomfortable. You dive together into questions that to others would be too strange. These encounters are rare, but they're worth the wait. A single deep relationship nourishes more than 100 shallow friendships. And the introverted intuitive, when they accept that math, stop suffering for not having a lot of people and start celebrating the few real ones they do have. There's a subtle detail that needs to be said about how this profile loves. When the introverted intuitive chooses someone, they offer a loyalty few people understand. It's not a loyalty of rules, it's of essence. They'll be there in the heavy silences and on the days when no one else shows up. They'll remember details you forgot. They'll see you in a way no one before has seen you. But in exchange, they also need to be seen. They need someone to make the effort to descend into their depths, not to settle for the surface they present day to day. And there lies the difficult equation. Whoever wants an introverted intuitive in their life needs to be willing to make that dive. And whoever is an introverted intuitive needs to have the patience to wait for someone willing to descend. All of this points to the most important concept in the entire Jungian body of work, the concept Marie-Louise von Franz dedicated decades to studying. The concept of individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming a unique individual, integrating unconscious and conscious, light and shadow, into a personal and non-transferable synthesis. For the introverted intuitive, this process isn't optional. It's the work of a lifetime. Ignoring it leads to deep sadness and to that terrible feeling of living the wrong life. Individuation doesn't happen in a weekend spiritual retreat. It doesn't come with quickly read courses or motivational quotes. It happens in the small moments when you choose to be true to yourself, even when it costs you dearly. In the job you walk away from because it's suffocating your soul. in the difficult conversation you have with your family because you can't keep pretending. In each of these choices, a piece of who you truly are rises to the surface and integrates into your consciousness. Von Franz used to say that this process hurts, that it requires confronting the shadow and letting go of identities that were useful in the past but today imprison you. But she also said that there's no real alternative. Whoever runs from individuation ends up living a borrowed life, performing a character that was never truly theirs. And that borrowed life charges a silent price, manifesting in restless nights and in wounds the body shows, without medicine being able to name them, but which the soul knows perfectly well what they are. Individuation has a curious point that Jung underlined many times. It's not self-centeredness. On the contrary, whoever becomes a true individual discovers that their singularity is precisely what connects them to humanity on a deeper level. The closer you get to what's unique within you, the more you touch what's universal in everyone. The great works of art and the spiritual teachings that still transform lives came from people who dove so deep into their individuality that they touched the common ground of human experience. Individuation, therefore, is the most paradoxical path there is. By becoming more yourself, you become more useful to the world than you'd ever be by trying to be like everyone else. And here we arrive at the central point of everything we've talked about so far. You're not broken, you're awakening. Everything you felt as a defect your whole life, every characteristic that made you feel out of place, is in fact a sign of a more conscious psyche than the average. The depth that wears you out is the same engine that allows you to see what no one else sees. The sensitivity that hurts you is the same one that connects you to the invisible layers of reality. The isolation that pains you is also the space where your individuation is silently happening. But there's something important that needs to be said before we wrap up, and Jung was the first to warn about it. No one needs to put themselves in a little box. These psychological types he described aren't prisons, they're maps. They serve to help you locate yourself and recognize traits that were already there without a name. But Jung himself made it clear, in more than one moment of his work, that no human being fits entirely into a classification. You can recognize yourself in INFJ, INTJ, INFP, or INTP, and still have characteristics that escape any label. You can grow and change, integrate functions that once seemed foreign, and discover parts of yourself no theory predicted. Individuation isn't fitting yourself into categories. It's precisely stepping out of them after having learned what they had to teach you, and building your own integrated identity. Carl Gustav Jung used to say, with all the humility of a man who dedicated his life to studying the human soul, that his typologies were tools, not absolute truths. Each person needs to find their own answers and live their own mystery. So take everything you heard today, use what resonates, and follow your path with more awareness. You weren't born to be like the others. You were born to wake up, to become whole, and perhaps, along the way, to help others wake up too. If this content touched something deep inside you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, and consider joining our members club, where we dive even deeper into these themes that transform the way you see yourself and relate to the world. Until our next meeting, and may your journey of individuation be entirely your own.